Welcome to Lesson 8. Today we are discussing Don DeLillo and his short story Midnight in Dostoevsky. So let's start with the author very briefly. Don DeLillo was born in 1936 in Bronx, this neighborhood in New York City. And this neighborhood and the experience of New York City itself became very important for his literature. Now, his parents were Italian immigrants, and they were blue-collar workers, meaning they performed kind of these menial jobs. They were working class, and he really didn't take literature seriously until he was really 18. That's when he began reading writers such as William Faulkner, or Ernest Hemingway, or James Joyce. And he was influenced especially by the way that they experimented with language and the narrative. Now, as I mentioned, the neighborhood Bronx where he grew up, it was at that time in the 50s, right? It was filled with this, like, for example, the jazz scene of Greenwich Village was very prominent. There was this boom of abstract expressionism and painting. So there were studios all over the place. Also, it was New York City was kind of a good place as far as films were concerned, especially European films by European auteurs were accessible, whereas somewhere in like rural Kansas this would have not been the case. So he grew up being exposed to filmmakers such as Luc Godard or Federico Fellini, and they certainly imprinted themselves upon his work. Now, he began his career first off as a copywriter, working in advertising, right? So coming up with slogans and advertising campaigns, and he did this for 5 years. Now, critics note that this kind of time in his life is kind of marked itself, right? And we see his preoccupation with consumer culture in the U.S. In many things that he writes, maybe not necessarily in Midnight in Dostoevsky, but certainly in his novels. Now, he is primarily considered a novelist, so he writes a long form short stories occasionally, and he has won the National Book Award as well as many other prestigious awards. DeLillo's novels are said to be kind of anxious, skeptical, in the way especially that they treat knowledge, what we can know for certain. In a sense, Midnight in Dostoevsky deals with this idea of definitive knowledge, right? It considers truth and the role of the writer in regards to kind of this shifting and changing aspect of knowledge and facts and truth, and the writer's attempts to capture it. His first success, DeLillo's first success, came with the novel White Noise, and then it was soon followed up with this next book, which he published in 1988, Libra. Now, Libra speculates on the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. So he's the man who was accused of having assassinated John F. Kennedy. Now, DeLillo researched the project very thoroughly, reading at least half of the Warren Commission report, which was this huge report, and he referred to this experience as kind of reading a Joycean novel, or the Oxford English Dictionary. Right? He compared it to that, meaning that the documents were very confusing. They were very showing several perspectives simultaneously, and not saying which of the presented ideas was truthful and which was less believable. But despite the fact, he managed to complete his novel, and I mention it because it kind of draws his undertaking in writing Libra draws a good parallel to what happens in Midnight in Dostoevsky. So bear this in mind. We'll come back to this idea. Now, Midnight in Dostoevsky was published in the New Yorker magazine. It was published in 2009, so this is a fairly recent short story. It was DeLillo's actually first short story. The last one since Still Life, which he published 2 years earlier in 2007. Now, the story's protagonist is the narrator. We later learned that his name is Robbie, or at least that's how he introduces himself to Jenna, the shy girl. And the antagonist turns out to be his friend Todd. And we say he's antagonist because essentially he will oppose the narrator in his final idea during the climax of the story. Now, there are two college freshmen, and they're kind of staying at this desolate and wintry college campus. And their pastime, as we know from the beginning, is arguing, right, and construing stories. This is what they do all the time. Now, the main subject of their argument at first is this old man, right, that they see in a hooded coat, right, and he kind of intrigues them. And they, first off, begin arguing about the coat, whether it's, a Laden coat, whether it's an anorak, or whether it's a parka. How would we describe this coat? This is their preoccupation. Of course, later on, when they have much more of the man's story filled out, the anorak or parka, it doesn't really matter, right? It says either or, right? So this detail from which their inspiration sparks is important only in the beginning. Now, the other two important characters in the story include Ilgaukes, their logics teacher, whom they seem very much kind of taken in by, and the shy girl, again, Jenna. Now, the narrator is interested in starting a conversation with her. So we have Ilgauskas, we have Jenna, and we have the man in the hooded coat. Those three main kind of characters. Of course, others get mentioned, but we would say that these three figures are most important for us, aside from the aforementioned protagonist and antagonist. The narrator and Todd. Okay, so what can we say about the conversation that Todd and the narrator have in the beginning? Why do you think it is so important to them to try to figure out exactly what sort of coat that the old man is wearing? So there are probably at least two kind of ways that we could take with this. We can make two arguments. The first one is kind of hinted by the fact that they're both counting the number of trains, the cars in the train that's passing them by. Right? They want to be able to know and describe their reality accurately. This seems to be their kind of preoccupation. So they want to know the facts. But there is a difference, right, between knowing the number of cars on a train and then knowing how to refer to a man's hooded coat. Now the difference is this, right? The number of cars on the passing train is fixed, right? So the boys can either count them accurately or they can miscount them. But either way, they possess the needed capacities to kind of arrive at the definite truth, right? So there were 80-some cars in this train at this time, right? That's a fact. But as the idea of kind of this objective truth seems an outdated notion to these guys, right? They feel uncomfortable when faced by, having both arrived at the same number of cars, right? So take a look at the highlighted section, right? So they have this unsettling feeling that made the world seem flat. Now, as far as the code is concerned, arriving at a factual kind of level with it is a lot more difficult. Now, the reason for this is that people refer to a given article of clothing differently, from culture to culture, or even in the United States from state to state. So as the boys' dialogue itself kind of suggests, right, we have the Inuit reference. So recall this postmodernist idea which we've discussed, that language is kind of an inadequate tool to describing reality, but it's essentially all we have, right? So this notion that language is inadequate is reflected here in the dialogue, right? The boys can't seem to agree on the best way to describe the coat. Now, the other reason why the boys might seem so interested in the code, right, it invites a more kind of self-reflexive or metafictional interpretations. Remember that self-reflexiveness and metafiction, we've talked about this in the John Barth's lesson. Those are some of the kind of essential qualities that define postmodernism. So we have this here as well, right? This is also a postmodernist story. Okay, so this is the other road that we can take with the same question, right? So so in order to kind of answer the boy's growing obsession with the hooded man, so we would have to ask the question, why do the boys seem so interested in being able to accurately describe their reality? One answer might be because they are college students, and this is what a typical college student should be interested in, right? This is why they went to college. But this is, I think, too superficial. More interesting and perhaps precise for these characters' diagnosis is that they might be, or the boys might have this kind of unspoken ambition to become writers. Thus, the ability to describe reality is especially, vital to them. We see this idea develop especially in the story's climax. And again, we'll return to this. Okay, so what about the boys' state of knowledge, right? So initially we might be impressed at their ability to conduct, and carry out arguments, and simultaneously count the cars of a passing train, right? So it seems like they are able to do two things simultaneously pretty well. So we might likewise be impressed by their knowledge of, say, duffel bags or toggles, right? Some of us might not even know what those are specifically. And why do you think that they tell us, the narrator specifically tells us here that they play chess and believe in God? So chances are that, he tells us this, he informs his readers of this probably for the same reason as kind of presenting the dialogue, right? So chess is considered to be one of the most, cerebral games, while, the declared belief in God by an argumentative college student kind of implies that he is approaching the matter of faith from an intellectual rather than spiritual perspective. Now, arriving at such a conclusion, that God exists intellectually, that requires a very, very significant amount of thought and study. In other words, the narrator wants to impress us with his intellect. The question is whether he or not he possesses at this age this sort of capacity to arrive at such, important questions just by through intellect alone. And indeed, the more we listen in on the conversation that the boys have, the more we realize that the narrator and Todd seem to be kind of more interested kind of in the superficiality of things or the aesthetic of things, especially of words, right? The appearances or sounds of words. Right, so the way it looks on the page or the way it sounds when it's pronounced. And we realize this when the narrator, for example, has a difficulty in discerning between the Baltic states and the Balkans, right? He kind of confuses them. And then he also likes the way that a German name with an umlaut looks, right? He says he thinks it might befit the old man. And then there's also their kind of inability to discern whether Ilgauskas is a Russian name or not. In other words, we see that their level of knowledge of these boys, it leaves a lot of room for improvement. And then we are introduced to the character of Professor Ilgauskas, right? So what can we make of him as a character? Why does he seem to be so important to these college freshmen? Why do, for example, they count the number of coughs that that he kind of produces each lesson? Why do they not dare to ask questions during his class, despite the fact that he uses Greek and German words without even explaining their definitions? Well, the answer might be simply that they feel ashamed by their lack of knowledge, right? Especially contrasted by his seeming knowledge or database that he has collected throughout his life. Ilgauskas seems like, a treasure chest of things that seem very precious because they are difficult to understand, comprehend, or follow. Now, do you think that the boys like him as a teacher, or do you think that they are simply amused by him? So, in other words, is there more to this attraction than just the fact that he is an oddball character? Now, one interesting thing, if you take a look at the excerpt above the pictured man's head, is their awareness that the professor regarded them as roadkill or irrelevant, right? And so, do you think, first off, do you actually believe that this was the case, or do you think that this is only their way of kind of imagining things, that this is what they think he thinks? Now, certainly such an idea forefronts what the boys must be feeling themselves, right? So this sense of inadequacy, especially when contrasted again with this college professor. So in other words, they seem to admire and fear Ilgauskas. In a sense, he's becomes this symbol of realized potential or adulthood, much like the man in the hooded coat. And these boys, essentially unwittingly, unknowingly, they're working to become like that. And we'll come back to this idea. So Ilgauskas asks, can we ask this question? And the boys wonder whether he's referring to the question he just asked, or to a different question, right? So again, our attention here with, for example, this small wordplay is again directed at this idea that language is inadequate, right, as a tool for conveying message, especially abstract thought. So there are limits to language's effectiveness. So let's discuss the narrator's exchange with the shy girl from his class, who we learn her name is Jenna. So what is the significance of this interaction? Why do you think the narrator is kind of interested in her? Is this primarily romantic, or is he looking for something else? Now, certainly we must agree that there is some sort of attraction going on, right? Robbie, the narrator, keeps sitting in front of her, trying to make eye contact with her. She kind of ignores him or just pretends not to see him. But she admits that she did spot him earlier in the gym, right? So the gym kind of being a physical place, so there is some sort of chemistry going on. But we know that the narrator is currently kind of invested in people who he can have these discussions and debates with, right? So this is what he finds meaningful currently. Hence his question about Ilgauskas, right? He asks her, what do you make of him? And that's where something interesting comes to light, right? We learned that the girl actually talked to the professor, so she did something that no other student seems to do. She broke some sort of unwritten rule that no one speaks to him during class. Now, thanks to her, Robbie, the narrator, learns that Ilgauskas reads Dostoevsky, quote, day and night, and he seems to be fascinated by this piece of information. Now, after the conversation is over, do we really have a sense that Robbie might start dating Jenna? Do you think that this is something that will happen later on in the story? Well, it seems that there's very little hints that might happen. Instead, we learn that Jenna is transferring to a different university somewhere in Idaho, and the narrator wonders why she decides to go to a place and whether or not their current campus is not obscure enough for her. But the narrator really doesn't dwell too much on this fact. But we could say that this episode kind of suggests that both Robbie and Jenna seemed to somehow be more interested by their professor than each other, right? In their conversation, he was kind of the pivotal figure, right? The narrator asks about him, and Jenna must have been intrigued enough by this man as well to kind of start talking to him, right? So she serves essentially, as far as the narrative is concerned, as an informant who provides an important, as the narrator deems it, piece of the puzzle. right? So she tells him again that he reads Dostoevsky day and night. Next, we are told that Robbie wants to be more, who wants to be more like his professor, begins reading Dostoevsky as well. Now, but Dalilo makes the experience seem kind of surrealistic and magical. So how does he achieve this? Well, if you take a look at the highlighted quote, he tells us first off that the narrator experienced Dostoevsky's prose, right? He assimilated the characters and they assimilated him. So they kind of became one. And Robbie also seems to lose a sense of himself and his place. It's almost as if he kind of melts into the reality of the novel, and he needs to look around to kind of figure out or remember where he actually is. So notice that this information is juxtaposed with the reason why he was left over, quote unquote, at the university for Christmas, right? He tells us that what his parents are up to, and basically we learn that they have more important things to do than to celebrate the holidays, or you know, to come together as a family, even for Robbie's sake, right? So this literature where he forgets himself, he forgets about his parents, it's an escape at this point, right? So perhaps this is what strengthens his experience of the novel, right? His personal life. But more importantly, you know, it also becomes seemingly the first thing that the narrator will have in common with Ilgauskas and the old hooded man. So perhaps now would be a good time to kind of return to Ilgauskas' reported quote that he reads Dostoevsky day and night. So why do you think Dostoevsky is so important to him? Well, we know that our narrator certainly suffers from solitude, especially during Christmas, and he finds great solace in literature. Now, is Ilgauskas described as a man who seems to be satisfied with his life and career? I mean, what clues does the narrator give us as to kind of his inner state? Well, for one thing, we know that the professor does not communicate with his students, right? He speaks to the wall, right? He lectures to the wall. He doesn't even look at them, and they don't ask questions because they fear it. So it's a very similar image if you think about it. A professor kind of lecturing above students' head, and he doesn't see the students and they're roadkill to him. It's a very similar image to that of, you know, a college student abandoned over Christmas on an empty campus, right? So we have these two very similar images of solitude, right? So we can therefore deduce that Ilgauskas likewise kind of finds solace in reading Dostoevsky. Great literature for him and the narrator seems to be, again, an escape. But can literature be more than just that? Can literature offer something more than just escape from your reality? So can it, for example, provide the reader with some truths that will help him navigate through life? Now, this is the question to some that gets answered in the climax of the story, or at least the question that is asked at the climax of the story. What should great literature do? But before we move on to it, let's consider first how Dalilo heightens and externalizes Robbie's experiences of Dostoevsky's literature. Not only does he construe this image of, you know, splendid solitude on campus, but he adds this seemingly magical element. Now, it's not actually magical, but the effect kind of seems magical. Robbie leaves his novel open to the page where he quit reading the day before, and when he comes back on the next day, he does this a few times, and returns to the library, and he finds the book is still open to that exact same page. So not only there seems to be no librarians or other students to kind of mess with the narrator's magical experience, but also the book seems to kind of comply, right? Rather than kind of flipping constantly open to some well broken in page, you know, as books often do. So it's a small element, but I think it heightens the effect pretty well. Okay, so we have the novel or literature serving as a sort of balsam for the soul, or at least for the narrator and Ilgauskas. It is their medicine, you know, to their existentialist problems, or at least problems of solitude. And into this idea, we can fit the old hooded man as well. Now, it is likely that he is plagued by, similar solitude. Right? He walks alone, right? And he seems very pensive as he walks. So his head is filled with thoughts and questions, and possibly other problems, and and existentialist woes that human beings age into. So, like the professor, he represents an adult life in opposition to kind of this young life that the freshmen exhibit, which is still filled with this hunger and lust for knowledge and experience. Now, this is something that the older men seem to have burned out on. But there's another reading that we could make as far as the narrator's experience of Dostoevsky is concerned. Recall the moment where Robbie walks out onto the sun parlor in the middle of the winter night wearing just pajamas, right? And he does this soon after he kind of experiences Dostoevsky literature. Now, afterwards, he climbs into bed and he has this kind of eureka moment. An epiphany comes to him, and a quote fills the room, right? Or it's everywhere in the room. This epiphany turns out to be an idea that the hooded man is in fact Russian and that he is the father of Ilgatkis. Everything seems to fit, right? This is what the narrator tells us. And remember that Robbie and Todd like to construe these kind of suppositions as to the man's personal life. So what does this moment of epiphany remind you of? Now, how could we call this kind of revelation that Bobby has? All right, it seems to be at least partially very artistic in nature. He seemed to figure out how to place various elements of the reality which he encountered and collected, and then place them in relation to each other so that they kind of form this beautiful and meaningful image, at least in his mind. It's beautiful and meaningful. This is essentially what a painter does as well. But Robbie found kind of this deep inspiration right in this scene. Something clicked in his brain, and it occurred right after he was reading Dostoevsky. And this is a very common experience for writers, where another work of art or a novel or a painting that they're taking in suddenly gives them inspiration and answers for how they should proceed with their own creations. So you see, we have this kind of metafictional aspect of the story as the narrator functioning here as a writer. Robbie is a writer who just experienced an important revelation for his narrative. He shares his thoughts with Todd, and they begin collaborating on the hooded man's story, right? And this is the word that the narrator uses. They collaborate. Now, notice what Robbie says about his revelation. It all fits together. It's a formulation. It's artful. It's structured. Now, some critics have noted that this might be, in fact, DeLillo's personal artistic manifesto. Now, regardless, we see this as the standpoint taken by Robbie, but not necessarily Todd. Now, recall their fight at the story's climax. Why do they get into this fight? Now, the superficial reason is that Todd wants to talk to the old hooded man, about whom they've already construed the story. Recall that they think that he's Ilgatkis' father, that he lives with his son's wife. I believe they call her Tatiana, and she helps him around. They wonder who helps him shave or whether he shaves alone, and they invent all these details like the coffee he drinks and the breakfast cereal that he eats and the cartoons that he kind of absently watches, right? So they have this idea, this very, very kind of literate idea of who he is. Robbie is perfectly happy with this story. He doesn't want to go talk to the man in case that they might learn some new facts that would kind of disintegrate their creation. So again, he's happy with the fiction because, as he says, it's artful, it's structured. But Todd, he wants to talk to the man. He wants to know the truth. He's not satisfied with what they made up, and he wants to confront the man. And thus they have the fight, right? So if we were to consider that both Todd and Robbie kind of embody these two conflicting ideas for what literature should achieve, or at least what the purpose of literature or fiction should be, how could we summarize them? Well, in a sense, Todd, by wanting to find out the truth about the man, is arguing that literature should express some sort of objective truth about the nature of mankind. Now, Robbie, on the other hand, stands for the idea that literature should be first and foremost beautiful. Now, should the writer therefore aim for truthfulness and sacrificing, for example, the work's aesthetic aspects for the sake of achieving truthfulness, or should he first and foremost cater to the aesthetic effect that his work produces? Now, this is the question that writers seem to have been asking ever since Aristotle's Poetics. Now, Dalilo's own stand on this matter is debatable. On one hand, his biographical background, in which I mentioned his work on the novel Libro, and again recall that it required a vast amount of very difficult research to compile a truthful portrait of Kennedy's assassin. So in a sense, we could say that chapter of the author's life kind of was this sort of pursuit of truth. So he did exactly what Todd does in this story. He runs after the man to find out the truth. But here, in this story, in Midnight in Dostoevsky, we don't get to verify who the hooded man is, right? The story ends before Todd gets the chance to learn whether or not he was in fact Russian. So thus the truth seems to escape us here, and what we're left with is just a compelling aesthetic experience.